Hey everybody, Professor H here again. I am going to provide you with a supplementary video for Chapter 9, talking about the cognitive and socio-emotional development in adolescence. Our initial video went over topics that were provided in the book. However, there are a lot of other things that I think you need to be aware of. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this PowerPoint so that you can have that extra information. I am still fighting being ill, so I might cough and all of that. And, you know, I know it may come as a surprise to you, but for some reason, I'm just not an internet sensation. I just don't understand why, but, you know, it's one of those things. All righty, so let's go ahead and get started. Once again, just to kind of review, when we talk about Piaget's cognitive theory of development, we are in the formal operational stage when we're talking about adolescence. We're not going to get into too much detail because that was for our cognitive video. The big main points, though, that I'm going to go ahead and recap for you are that during the formal operational stage, our youth is able to have really good abstract thought. They no longer require a concrete things or the events like to be in front of them in order to think about them concretely. They can imagine the possibilities and they can think of things that might be true. They also have something called hypothetical deductive reasoning or thinking. This is the ability to develop hypotheses about how to solve problems. One of the tasks that is used to demonstrate hypothetical deductive reasoning is called the pendulum task. What happens during this task is that kids are given a series of different weights, and these are the weights right here, and different lengths of string. They are going to be shown a pendulum swinging, and then they're going to be asked the question of what determines the speed of this pendulum swinging? Is it the weight? Is it the length of the string? What is it? A child that is in the pre-operational stage long day. A child that is in the concrete stage basically can solve this problem in a more random fashion. They may just try different things and kind of come up with the answer, but then they have a difficult time really explaining what the answer to this problem is or how they came up with that answer. Somebody in formal operations, however, goes about solving the problem in a very methodological way. In other words, they would say, okay, let's just try all the different lengths of the strings. So they're only changing one factor at a time. This would occur because these kids have also had a basic scientific background if they are in a Western culture. So they systematically try different things until they come up with a solution to the problem. And then they are able to explain how they came up with their solution. So that's kind of the difference between the concrete and the formal operational stages. So there are limits to Piaget's theory. It is thought that not everyone reaches the formal operational stage. 1/3 of US adolescents and 1/2 of US adults are thought to be able to reach this formal operational stage, where you have this more complicated, more scientifically based thinking. However, another drawback of this particular theory is that virtually no one in tribal or village societies can reach this stage according to the way that it's measured according to Piaget's theory. Basically, people who are growing up in these tribal and village societies go about their problem solving a little bit differently in ways that are more relevant to their own culture and their own needs. They do not have the formal science training, and so they don't go about the problem solving in the same way, yet they are still able to solve the problems that come up in their own societies. Piaget may have ignored other aspects of mature thought. That's another criticism of Piaget's theory. And we know that throughout Piaget's theory, children are actually reaching these stages at an earlier time than he thought, because nowadays we have better ways of testing kids to see where they are at with their thinking. So yeah, that was cognitive, but it's just a recap that I thought was good to keep in there. So now what I want you to do is I want you to consider this question that I'm going to pose to you. In Europe, a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. This is called the Heinz dilemma. I would like you to consider this and think about how you feel about this problem. Should the husband have done that? Why or why not? So at this point, you might want to just kind of pause the video for a minute and ponder this. And unfortunately, we don't have a face-to-face class, and in a face-to-face class right now, we would be able to have some really good discussion. So that's kind of a bummer. All right, so pause and consider. Okay, moving on. This is a problem which demonstrates Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. According to Kohlberg, there are different stages of moral development. These stages of moral development can be demonstrated through the use of moral dilemmas, such as the Heinz dilemma, which we just read. In addition, when you progress through the stages in Kohlberg's theory of moral development, you switch from externally processing this information to internally controlled behavior. So in other words, you use something called internalization. So you basically, instead of having outside sources influence what you think is moral and right, you start thinking internally. What are my internal beliefs? It's not what society says. It's what do I think is right? What do I think is moral behavior? So that's a shift as you go through the stages from external to internal. I'm not going to ask you about the term internalization. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Okay, so the first level of moral development, according to Kohlberg, is level 1, the pre-conventional level. Now, each of these levels has several sub-levels or sub-stages to them, but we're not going to get into that kind of detail in this class. So according to this pre-conventional level, rules should be followed to either avoid punishment or earn rewards. So when you're making moral choices based on those things, those are external factors. So you're externalizing your moral choice at that point. So an argument regarding the Heinz dilemma would be, it's against the law, it is bad to steal, you'll get in trouble. So those are reasons why people would say that he did the wrong thing by trying to steal the drug for his wife. Maybe they had children and he might need someone at home to look after them, but maybe he shouldn't steal it because they might put him in prison for a year, for years that he could stand. Okay, that's a quote from a kid, which is a terrible quote, but basically what it's demonstrating is that the different reasons why kids or people in this pre-conventional stage, how their processing works. So basically it's based on external stimuli. So level 2, sorry, still sick. Level 2, conventional level. Rules should be followed to earn social approval from others and because members of a society have an obligation to obey. So this is a little bit deeper reasoning. So you're thinking a little harder about this. So it was really the druggist's fault. He was unfair, trying to overcharge and letting someone die. Hines loved his wife and wanted to save her. I think anyone would. I don't think they would put him in jail. The judge would look at all sides and see that the druggist was charging too much. Okay, so that's one argument according to the conventional level. Another argument would be, if everyone did as he wanted to do, set up his own beliefs as to right and wrong, then I think you would have chaos. The only thing I think we have in civilization nowadays is some sort of legal structure which people are sort of bound to follow. So society needs a centralizing framework. So according to this stage of moral development, you say that it is either correct or incorrect based on societal approval. And for the final stage of moral development, level 3, which is called the post-conventional stage. And in this post-conventional level, rules must be examined and changed if they don't preserve and protect human rights and values. In some cases, following your conscience may be more important than following the rules. So here are the arguments from the level 3 of post-conventional moral development. It is the husband's duty to save his wife. The fact that her life is in danger transcends every other standard you might use to judge his satisfaction. Life is more important than property. Usually the moral and legal standpoints coincide. Here they conflict. The judge should weigh the moral standpoint more heavily, but preserve the legal law in punishing Hines lightly. And then another argument is Hines should steal the drug to save his wife because preserving human life is more important than preserving property. So in this stage of development, we are considering what the social and societal norms are. However, we are coming from an internalized motivation. What is our personal feelings about what is right and wrong, and acting according to those? All right, so critics of Kohlberg's theory is that moral thought is different than moral behavior. So people would act differently in real life than they would just answering a question on a quiz. So when they presented these problems to people, we're talking about just people like you and me who are sitting there and reading a problem and then saying how we'd respond to it. And there is a difference between that and how we may actually respond in real life. They are culturally biased, so it depends on what culture you are in. Would kind of like we talked about with Piaget's theory, how it didn't really pan out very well across cultures in some ways. Same thing with Kohlberg's theory. According to some cultures, this line of moral reasoning would not pan out based on certain cultures and societies. Understanding underestimated family relationships, justice versus care perspective. We're not going to go over this last part of the slide because it's irrelevant to our class. All right, I'm going to just real quickly recap. We talked about this a little bit in the previous presentation, so I'm just going to hit on it a little bit right here. Remember, there are a couple of concepts that have to do with adolescent egocentrism. The first of which is the imaginary audience. That is the belief that you are the focus of everyone's attention and concern. And I use the example of having like a spot on your shirt, or your hair is messed up and you go into class, or you have a pimple, something like that. And you walk into class and you think everybody is staring at you. You know, maybe some people are laughing in the back. You figure they're talking about you and laughing about you. Most likely that is not the case. So the imaginary audience is something that is very powerful during adolescence. It's probably like most strong during that period of time. And it is something that, once again, doesn't all the way go away in adulthood. It's just we rein it in quite a bit as we develop. And the other note underneath where it says adolescent egocentrism, that refers to the heightened sense of self-consciousness that teenagers have. The second one is personal fable. We went over this in the other slide, also, other presentation also. It is a sense of uniqueness and invulnerability. So I think the example that we had was drinking and driving, where a youth is like, well, yeah, I can do this because I can hold my liquor and I can handle this better than the average person. I'm a much better driver than the average person. So I can get away with this where somebody else might not be able to. So that's kind of an example of a personal fable. There's a whole bunch of ways you can go with that. All right, during adolescence, kids go through this transition to high school, which can be a very traumatizing time. They're having more responsibility piled onto them at this time. And at the same time, their hormones are going a little bit wacky. So they have to deal with all that puberty stuff that we talked about also in the earlier lectures. Achievement is positively correlated with parental involvement, peer support for academic achievement, higher income and education of family, social capital, which is family and community resources and the ability to use those things, and high quality school with mixed ability classes. So these are factors that contribute to success for adolescents transitioning to high school. Adolescents have very high risk-taking behavior compared to other groups. This increases when kids are with their peers. Boys have a tendency to be more risk-taking than girls, and alcohol abuse is a big risk during this time period. We have things that actually are correlated with higher alcohol use are the things below that I'm going to read to you, and a couple of them might be surprising. Okay, teenage drinking. Teenage drinking does not necessarily mean that somebody is going to turn into an alcoholic, but there is an increased risk for it. Sports participation, because sports clubs, you know, the football team, the baseball team, volleyball team, whatever, they get together, have parties, all that kind of stuff. These groups often have higher alcohol abuse risks than others. We talked before about how people externalize or internalize their problems and how these can be difficulties. You know, when you externalize, you're saying that somebody else is causing your problem and you're not taking responsibility for it. People with that type of responsibility, when they hit their adolescence, this can also, this externalizing tendency can increase alcohol abuse risk. And then another group, which I found surprising, and I'm so sorry I do not have the research paper to back up on this, and if you're interested, I'll find it for you, so just email me. That is girls with high academic achievement. Actually, girls with high academic achievement often have a higher risk for alcohol abuse. All right, so some more school issues to talk about is dropping out. And for some reason, your book doesn't even go into this. So for dropping out, there are lifelong consequences, some of which are lower literacy scores, wow, lower employment rates, and more likely to work in a low-paying or low-level jobs. A lot of jobs require a high school diploma. And there are certain factors that are related to dropping out. School-related reasons are like 50%, which is, you know, just having trouble with getting through school. That kind of covers a large area of things that have to do with actually obtaining the education. Economic reasons, 20% drop out due to economic reasons because they have to stop and help maybe get a job to help pay for stuff in the family. And this is here in the United States I'm talking about, not developed countries. This is not developing countries. This is in the United States. Other economic reasons might be that they are having to stay home and watch a child because the family can't afford childcare. And then 33% is considered personal reasons. And this can cover a lot of different things. So we're not gonna, this isn't all in our book. I just wanted to kind of share this with you. And I will go ahead and move to the next slide. This is just a graph, and this is from like an earlier version of your book that talks about 16 to 24-year-olds who have dropped out of school. So if we want to look at these dropout rates, 10% of all students drop out and never earn a GED or diploma. The dropout rates we have from 0 to like about 35% here. And if we look, the white and non-Hispanic and non-Latino white are at the lowest dropout rate. Blacks are the next. African Americans are the Black, non-Hispanic, African American is the second highest group for dropouts. And then the Latino population is the highest group for the dropouts. And a lot of this has to do with socioeconomic status that can lead to these trends. I mentioned previously in our other video that during adolescence, when the beginning of adolescence, we see a lot of bickering, which is that petty, peevish arguments, usually repeated and ongoing. This conflict with parents and with siblings is escalated during this time. However, towards the end of adolescence, this type of bickering and arguing seems to subside. The conflict is greater during early adolescence. And part of this is due to differing definitions of what is appropriate behavior for someone of that age, and that teenagers are at a point where they are questioning their parents' rules. They are starting to develop their own ideas about the world and question how their parents view the world. Another important factor that I wanted to mention that was not mentioned in the previous video that I think is super important is how sleep changes during adolescence. During the period of adolescence, these kids need about 9 hours of sleep. And what happens with kids during this period is that their clock is set wrong for school. In other words, their biological clock and their circadian rhythms seem to change a little bit. Your average adolescent is not ready to function till about 10 o'clock in the morning. And then they are wanting to stay up until about midnight. Now, that is not just because they're, defiant teenagers. That is actually a physiological thing that occurs within adolescence that changes their sleep patterns. And these sleep patterns don't start to shift back until they are getting into their early 20s, at which time we're going to see some different sleep problems, especially depending on if they're college students, which is like delayed sleep phase syndrome and things like that we're going to talk about in our next chapter. All right, friends are very, very important during adolescence. We touched on this before. Friends serve as some very important social needs. The first one is a need for intimacy. Now remember, intimacy is being close with somebody. I'm not talking about sexual relationships, although kids and adolescents do have sexual relationships. When I talk about intimacy, I'm talking about that friend that you can tell anything and that you could trust and be close to. Whether that is somebody that you have a romantic relationship or not is aside from that intimacy. Having mutual understanding and loyalty are super important for friendships during this period of time, and the ability to be self-disclosing and having this type of friends relationship actually increases self-esteem as well. The little graph that is being shown on this page is showing the time spent with parents versus the time spent with friends. If you'll notice here, from 2nd to 5th grade, this time spent with parents is escalating. So you're getting more time with parents. Then from about 5th grade, it starts to drop. The time with parents starts to drop. That's this blue line. And you'll notice that by the time they're in 10th grade, we're way down here, very low amount of time spent with parents. And in contrast, a very high amount of time spent with friends. So friends are very much more influential to kids in adolescence than they were in the previous time, whereas parents were more influential then. Peer pressure is a problem. That's social influence to change attitudes, values, or behaviors in order to align with group standards. In our previous video, we went over cliques and crowds. Clique is a small group from about 2 to 12 kids that form on the basis of similar activities or interests. And a crowd is a larger group structure based on reputation. So members may or may not spend much time together. So you might say the punk kids You can have a clique of punk kids that are part of that crowd that is the punk scene. So that's just kind of an example. Dating and romantic relationships, 40% of sixth graders like somebody, and I mean like. 50% of 10th graders had a romantic relationship that lasted at least 2 months, and 60% of 12th graders had a relationship that lasted for 11 months or longer. So romantic relationships and dating in whatever form it's going to take is very important in adolescence as well. I'm talking about Western society here. Remember, I am talking about in developed countries like the United States. All right, juvenile delinquency. This occurs when an adolescent breaks the law or engages in behavior that is considered illegal. And we talked about different types of juvenile delinquency in our last lecture. About 2% of all adolescents are involved in juvenile court cases. So, you know, it's not a huge percentage of the court cases. However, males are 3 times more likely than females to be involved in juvenile delinquency. There are different types. There's that early onset that we talked about before, which is criminal activity beginning early in childhood and continuing throughout life. It signifies or is correlated with, as I feel more comfortable saying correlated with, certain biological things like having a short attention span, hyperactivity, poor emotional regulation, lower intelligence, malnutrition, maternal smoking during pregnancy, and severe child abuse. These are all things that have been correlated with this. Remember, correlation is not causation. So these are just things that are correlated with this early onset type of juvenile delinquency. Late onset type, criminal activity starts around puberty and typically stops by the age of 21. This signifies psychosocial problems, maybe hanging out with deviant friends, maybe not having a lot of good connections at school, crowded, violent, and unstable neighborhoods, unemployment, like family unemployment, drugs and alcohol, close relatives in jail. These are all risk factors for late onset type. And then there is the type of juvenile delinquency that we talked about in the other chapter, where it moves forward and becomes kind of a lifelong criminology type thing. All right, so we're going to talk real quick about depression. Depression, what is depression? Feelings of sadness, frustration, and hopelessness. Loss of pleasure in most activities, disturbances in sleep, appetite, concentration, energy, and it must last at least 2 weeks. Now, everybody's probably experienced these feelings at some time, but to actually suffer from depression, clinical depression, these feelings of sadness are much deeper and much more painful than just your average sadness of, oh, I had a bad day, or I'm kind of bummed out about things. This is a type of sadness that you cannot shake off and that really sticks with you. You know, you're kind of in a very dark place and it's very hard to get out. And it is not just being sad where you can just snap out of it and move forward. 15 to 20% of teens experience depression. 2 to 8% are chronically depressed. So that 15 to 20% at some point in time are experiencing these depression symptoms that we showed on the screen here. 2 to 8% are chronically depressed, which means that this is going to be an ongoing problem, not just sad for a short while, but ongoing. Girls are 2 times more likely to suffer from depression. We believe, or the scientific community seems to believe at this point, that I'm kind of simplify things a little bit, but there are some kind of hormonal and genetic reasons why this could be, in addition to societal factors. There's a lot of societal factors that would predispose women to having more depression as well. So some risk factors for depression. First of all, biological factors. We do know that there is a genetic component to depression. And I'm not going to get into these short allele, long allele. There are certain markers that we know that if they are present, if somebody has these genetic markers, sorry about the dogs, Can you do something for me? Thanks. Certain biological markers that indicate that somebody may be more at risk for depression. However, the depression may never manifest itself if there is no stress or factor like that involved. People that there's studies that show that people who have these genetic markers, if they are subject to child abuse or being hungry all the time, any type of stressful factor, being in foster care, different things like that, like negative, a bad experience type thing. Not all foster care is bad. I'm just saying as an example that when these stress factors are present, depression is more likely to develop. If somebody has these same markers and they do not experience a very stressful situation, they are not as likely to develop that depression. Depression is also linked to negative body images in males and females. Females have a tendency to have more problems with body image. Low popularity is another risk factor in adolescence, and low achievement in school. Family dysfunction and marital discord. In other words, if the parents are always fighting, this is also another risk factor for depression. Another risk factor that we did not talk about is that somebody is a member of the LGBTQ community. That is our highest rate of suicide with that particular population. So some protective factors for depression are good relationship with parents, a particular area of competence or expertise. So if somebody is really good at something, if they have one area that they can kind of latch onto and feel that they're good at, that is another kind of protective factor for depression. And if they take on a role that includes responsibility, that also seems to help. We also know that getting enough exercise helps with depression. It increases your serotonin level, which is a neurotransmitter that is thought to be involved in depression. It's thought that people suffering depression do not have enough serotonin available in their brain, and exercise can elevate that serotonin. And there are some other factors as well, but we'll just stick with this since we're talking about adolescence. All right, I already talked about why is depression more common in girls. Another thing I didn't mention that was another hypothesis about why it is more common is what's called gender typed coping styles. Girls are more likely to internalize and ruminate over things. Internalizing is they are taking on, and we talked about externalizing and internalizing factors before. So when something goes wrong, like they get a bad score on the test, they have more likely to say, I'm stupid because I did bad on the test, instead of, oh, I did poorly, but I can just study and do better next time. They tend to internalize it and bring that in. And rumination means that you repeatedly think about past experiences or moods. You repeatedly go over things in your head over and over. Females have a tendency to do that more than males, according to a lot of the research. Boys are more likely to externalize. And the thing about boys, like the girl may be thinking this over in her head over and over again, where a guy is just going to go punch somebody. So boys are more likely to externalize and act aggressively or disruptively. And these are just patterns that are the majority. There's always exceptions to these things. All right, so now we're going to talk about a very important subject, which is suicide. And I can't guarantee that these statistics are completely up to date because this is an older PowerPoint. If anything, I would say that these statistics are probably higher than they are in this PowerPoint. If you're interested, just email me and I can get you a document that has the most recent information on suicide for you. All right, so suicidal ideation is thinking seriously about suicide. 19% of high school girls and 10% of high school boys consider suicide. Right now, you guys know that I am a first responder. I go out with law enforcement on calls when there is some type of mental health issue going on. And I would say probably like 3/4 of my calls right now are for adolescents and adolescents with suicidal ideation that have posted something or said something to somebody or have even taken action. So right now it's a very tough thing, especially with all this COVID stuff. It's made it a little bit tougher. So 19% of high school girls and 10% of high school boys have suicidal ideation. That means they think about suicide. They consider it and think about it like, maybe I should kill myself. Parasuicide is any potentially lethal action against the self that does not result in death. So this is different than like non-suicidal self-mutilation, like cutting or something like that. This is something totally different. Parasuicide would be something like, oh, I'm gonna take some pills and try to OD, but they don't take enough pills to OD. So in that particular case, 9% of girls have done something like that, and then 4.5% of boys. Males are actually much more successful at suicide than females. And the way that they do it is different. Males are more likely to use a firearm and females are more likely to take pills. Okay, this actual suicide rate, I'm not going to talk about that because we'll just talk about suicide rates in another slide because that's actually too low. For every completed suicide, there are 1,000 parasuicides. So there are a lot of attempts for each actual successful suicide. All right, so factors that increase the risk of teen suicide: availability of guns, use of alcohol and other drugs, lack of parental supervision, history of abuse, lack of social support, recent and current stressful circumstances, and a culture that is accepting of suicide. You know, we can also put on there lack of acceptance for sexual orientation, because that is a big one when it comes to risk factors in suicide for teens. Gender differences, we already talked about this. In the US, adolescent males are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. Males are more likely to use lethal methods. Females are more likely to let friends and family know that they are depressed. So males also often don't reach out as straightforwardly. Oftentimes, you know, a male might start giving stuff away. Like they can just give, oh, here, this is my favorite thing. I want you to have this. And they will do subtle things like that, but they are less likely to reach out and say, you know what, I'm really depressed. I am really having a problem with all of this. A female can do that most of the time easier than a male. Those are just things that we have noticed or that the research has supported. Oh, there we go. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the Trevor Project. So the Trevor Project is a project that was put in place to help with the suicidality of the LGBTQ community. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people ages 10 to 24. So that's pretty crazy that kids from 10, and I've been out to a 10-year-old's house that had a knife and was trying to commit suicide, or wanting to, but didn't, thank goodness. But second leading cause of death. That's pretty dang intense if you ask me. And you can go on to the, let's see, the National Institute of Health website, or I'll put some links on Canvas for the suicide stuff because I have a lot of stuff on that, so that you can just go right to the websites and look at the research and look at the data for yourself. LGBTQ youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. And I have the references for this one. For this slide, I put all the references. LGBTQ, and I don't know why I have LGB, because it might not have looked at transgender and queer in this particular study. That's probably why it doesn't say LGBTQ. Of all suicide attempts made by youth, LGB youth suicides were almost 5 times as likely to require medical treatment than those of heterosexual youth. Like sometimes we'll go out on calls and it's a kid that maybe they took something, but they were not sent to the hospital. And, or maybe, you know, the parent, amazingly, people wait. They like, instead of taking someone right to the hospital, they just wait. And they're like, well, maybe we'll call 911 now and say she tried to commit suicide. And it's crazy. But it's hard. Oftentimes people who are very close are not seeing what's happening with the kids because they're just too close to it. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt. 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt. So you can just guess that when these people were adolescents, they were already having these thoughts. 92% of these individuals reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. LGBT youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as LGBT peers who report no or low levels of family rejection. So that support is really important. 1 out of 6 students nationwide, grade 9 to 12, seriously considered suicide in the past year. Each episode of LGBT victimization, such as physical or verbal harassment or abuse, increases the likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times on average. So, you know, and this Trevor Project is I don't know if I have the number on here. Nope. All right, well, I'll have that on Canvas and I'll try to put it below in the description on this video too. I'll put the information for the Trevor Project and the suicide hotline and all that kind of stuff I'll put down in the description of the video. So you guys can just get to it right there. The next page is just my references for that particular slide, because I just want to make sure you guys can take a look at this research yourself, because there's a lot more in there if you're interested. Hey, that's it. Okay, so we are done with this one. I hope you guys didn't fall asleep and that you managed to stay awake through the video. I know, being a internet star like I am, you know, that it's just hard to look away when I'm speaking, but you know, hang in there. All right, you guys, take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you in the next time.